Thanks, Andres. I also wanted to note on the fourth floor, there's an all-gender restroom in Building 9. So that's one of the many initiatives that I'm a part of is in my vice provost role, which is making the campus more accessible, more welcoming, more inclusive, et cetera. I'm happy to be here to talk about the city of Philadelphia. And I think this paper, which was recently published in the journal Urban Morphology, has a lot of relationship to the concept of urban ground floors. I read in one of the abstracts in this nice booklet, maybe a scholar from Brazil is talking about Portuguese architecture, that it's simple. It's kind of simple architecture. I forget the exact term, but it's just architecture that comes down to the ground. So every piece of architecture has a ground floor, and it's common in vernacular architecture. And that's what I'll be talking about today, essentially a vernacular cityscape, but not a vernacular street and block design. In fact, a quite organized street and block design, although the builders, as far as I can tell, were vernacular. And it's a very interesting essay, I think, in the relationship between streets, settlement, and block form. And I think the ground floor, and especially the quality of mixed use that this street network attains in Philadelphia, is a consequence of that as well. So hopefully there'll be some time for conversation. I'll go manual. That doesn't seem to be working either. Aziz to the rescue. There we are. Is it just slow? Okay. I won't be talking about this grid, but the United States, as you know, is a nation composed of rectilinear cities. This is our national survey initiated in the late 18th century and shaping the great majority of the urban fabric of the US, especially as you get out toward the land across the Appalachian Mountains. You cross the Mississippi River in almost every state except for Texas, which has a Spanish and Mexican settlement pattern, is organized along this rectilinear grid, which has tremendous impacts on the built form of the United States, both urban and rural, since it extends across the country. But note here, now what did I do? Okay, there's no pointer. Where's the pointer? This, it doesn't show up on the screen, but this small red dot, that's Philadelphia. And so the area in white is not organized along that national grid. This was an area, of course, of British settlement in the 17th, and 18th centuries. And there are many gridded cities on the East Coast that are essentially experiments. They're kind of sui generis, one-time urban experiments. And if you read the work of people like John Reps, et cetera, you learn about some of these kind of canonical examples of urban forms, such as New Haven, Connecticut, my hometown, Savannah with its small parks. But I want to talk about the city of Philadelphia, often recognized for its original plan, but much more interesting, in fact, because Philadelphia is almost the only city that had a sui generis original street grid that then it was vastly extended across the course of the 19th centuries. Philadelphia was the third largest city in the US in the 19th century. Today it's 8th or 11th or something like that. And so this grid was essentially extended over time from 1683 up until the end of the 19th century. And what we see is a pattern of vernacular experimentation that offers, I think, tremendous lessons for those of us interested in urban design. So I wanted to examine this unique grid to understand it, to learn from it, moving on from what I think is the dominant dialogue about Philadelphia, which is just the original 1683 grid, and then the study stops there. Some of the questions that I asked in the study were, how did the grid change during essentially 200 years of dense urban development? This is pre-20th century suburbanization, so through the end of the 19th century to the early 20th, especially when the city grew extremely rapidly. Why did the grid evolve in the way that it did? And grid evolution is an important thing to examine here, because when you look at other grids like Barcelona's and New York's, which will be my references apart from Philadelphia, those grids really did not evolve. They essentially were laid out and they didn't evolve. There weren't additional essays in them as extensive as Philadelphia's, nor were they as adaptable as Philadelphia's. And Philadelphia's grid both extended, but also adapted. So I wanted to look at how that grid changed, addressed urban development changes, particularly how to develop housing and small mixed uses as densely as possible within the city fabric. So I looked at the morphological dimensions and consequences of those changes. And then something for us to think about: what lessons does this hold for other cities with urban grids, particularly when we're interested in pedestrian activity, the relationship between pedestrian activity and vehicular activity, questions of navigability, questions of diversity and choice when you're navigating a cityscape. Philadelphia succeeds admirably in all of these, by the way. I'm a great fan of Philadelphia's. Just some key findings so you know what I'll be talking about. First, the original grid, like many urban designs, had a lot of shortcomings, and it was inadequate in many ways, particularly in terms of circulation. The circulation of the grid was inadequate. And it was addressed. It was addressed through urban design that occurred over time in the subsequent 200 years. We're looking at an interesting feature of Philadelphia is that one dimension of the grid remained fixed, another did not, because the city extended only to the north and south, and it could not extend to the east or far to the west because of water. The city is constrained. It's on an isthmus. It's constrained by water. As I said before, the street grid is apparently regular, but it provides a high density of housing, a diversity of street types, and a very, very high diversity of pedestrian experiences, which makes it, to me, the exemplar in rectilinear grid studies. And I will wait for someone to tell me there's a better one, but I think Philadelphia's is the best. A much richer experience than the pedestrian, than the much better known grids of New York and Barcelona, of which I have several critiques. So for us city designers, if we're interested in a high diversity of experiences and activities, particularly on the ground floor, this multi-scalar network of streets you find in Philadelphia should be of some interest. Study morphology, study methodology was fairly straightforward. First, we identified, and I worked on this with a master city planning student, Elaine Wong, who I just graduated, extremely skilled in GIS and interested in this topic. Identified the relevant data, a lot of historical maps, which I'll show you some of. There's a rich series of historic maps that actually explain the development of the city, and contemporary cadasters, the city's current mapping. We digitized a lot of data, constructed a GIS of Philadelphia, and then measured and analyzed the grid, and then synthesized and interpreted the findings for our questions about urban design, diversity, choice, street network, et cetera. So the study starts with this pen grid. If you've studied urban design, I know many or most of you have, you'll see this drawing eventually. Thomas Holmes drew this survey up for William Penn when Penn was granted this land that belonged, of course, to Native Americans, but he was granted it by the King of England, and came over and surveyed this ideal city. This is the famous Penn survey of Philadelphia, notable for a central square and four parks at different corners of the grid, and then a street grid that is somewhat, but not entirely regular. You notice that it's quite regular in this dimension, but these are not regular. That's a shortcoming that would have to be addressed by later generations of urban builders. So some qualities of this grid that are of interest: it had a vast scale for the era. When you think that this was surveyed in 1683, Philadelphia was as large in this planned form as contemporary London, which is incredible, right? Because that would have been the largest city known to its framers. So some ambition there in framing this gigantic city. It actually took 200 plus years for this to fill in. This wasn't filled in until the late 19th century. It was sui generis. There has not been a similar one since. There's no direct antecedent, although scholars have racked their brains. This is a pattern in urban form scholarship. Where are the antecedents to this? What are the origins of this grid? It's not entirely clear, but there are some Roman settlements, et cetera, that may have been inspirations. It was not connected to an expectation of settlement and density. So this is something for us all to think about. When you design a street grid, does that determine what the density of the settlement in the city that results will be? Not necessarily. So you see in New York, the buildings seemed to get denser all the time. And Rem Koolhaas, of course, in Delirious, New York, thought that this was the coolest thing about New York. You could build whatever you wanted within the grid. Philadelphia's was not connected to an expectation of density, but it filled in with brick row houses. So this became the pattern of development for over 200 years, and it's the sort of the warp and weft of what we'll see. The grid was simultaneously built as surveyed but evolved. And I think scholarship on the topic has been lazy, frankly. People say, well, the grid didn't foresee the growth of the city and it was outmoded, and they sort of conclude that and don't look at what actually happened. That's actually totally untrue that it was outmoded. The grid, in fact, evolved substantially to accommodate all of the flaws that scholars have found in superficial examinations. 20th century, by the way, like many American cities, the 20th century was cruel to the city of Philadelphia. A lot of the grid was destroyed, a lot of neighborhood development, but far less negative than many other American cities that were even more substantially altered, such as the city of Detroit that some of us have looked at. Okay, so this is our analytical map that we constructed. It's showing some of the findings that I'll discuss. First of all, in black, we see what are called primary streets. These are the streets that were surveyed by Penn and constructed. In red, we see what are called secondary streets. And you'll see that they're running east-west and that they don't all make it to the waterfront. The city started here. They start and stop at different areas. By the way, yellow connotes that they're removed, and these are 20th century alterations, which we'll ignore. And then green, tertiary streets. We call these tertiary streets. These are alleys. They might be a meter wide. Some of the narrowest urban streets in the United States, maybe 1-2 meters wide, too narrow for cars in many cases. So this is the graphic, and some of the statistical findings are the following. First, we found that, as you might imagine, when you look at this, you're looking at the dimension this way, right, from north to south. The blocks were extremely deep. The average dimension is 666 feet, it turns out. But the width is shallower. The width was 468 feet from this dimension. If you're moving west from the rivers, that dimension on average is 468 feet. Recall that a Manhattan block is 200 feet by 800 feet, right? Manhattan has these. And I forget Barcelona block dimensions, but does anybody know? 100 by 100 meters, so that would be almost 400 feet by 400. So not too dissimilar from what Philadelphia ended up with, as we will see. So here are some of the findings of what happened within the initial grid, that during the 18th and 19th century, block lengths were subdivided by secondary streets. Those are the streets in red. The result of those is very consistent. They effectively half the dimension of the blocks, changing the mean depth to 383 feet. So in other words, these secondary streets were resolving the east-west circulation issues. There weren't enough streets to move west in Philadelphia. So builders or surveyors, we don't know who, surveyed additional streets cutting through that in order to provide additional circulation to the west and changing the blocks to a much narrower structure. So for example, this block from Chestnut to Walnut is essentially halved, and now Sansom Street will take you all the way west, carrying additional traffic and providing additional room for urban development, but not fully sufficient room for urban development. So this subdivision with streets solves a problem that I find to be, in fact, quite rare in New York and in Barcelona, where the grids have essentially remained quite static. In New York City, there are only a few streets that have been cut through the existing 1811 grid. It's Lexington and Madison Avenues. Broadway is pre-existing, okay? So that's one dimension of how this grid evolved. I then looked at grid expansion and further evolution of the Philadelphia grid. And a very interesting fact that you find in the first map of Philadelphia, this is from 1762, so during the British colonial era, Philadelphia was the largest city in the British colonies. Well, the Penn grid, imagine the city extending neatly from the Delaware River to the Schuylkill. But in fact, the city grew along the Delaware River to the north and the south. And already the city began to expand beyond the north and south boundaries of the grid. So what happens? What do you do when you have to build beyond the surveyed grid? You will have to survey an additional grid. So I examined this in detail and found that these streets follow the dimensions of the Penn grid, but only partly, and they constitute another vernacular solution to the development problem of access and development. Just tracing this evolution through time. This is one from 1794. Notice that the city is shown with, this is more or less east at the bottom for some time because all of the urban development was there. And then in the 19th century, it switches and you're looking at true north-south in the maps. Beautiful maps of Philadelphia. Here we go with true north-south. And we're starting to see here a different grid. So I looked at this in some detail. This is both to the south of the original grid, and then to the north, where you see there's much more topography that caused some irregularities. This is an analytical map we generated of South Philadelphia, showing what I call an unplanned grid in blue, and then a third grid, which I call the planned expansion grid in red, which I'll talk about last. And these are just maps for reference. You can see, just like Broadway in New York, you have these diagonal streets running through the both South Philadelphia and North Philadelphia. This is Center City, and this is, the grid was extended a vast dimension. I think several kilometers to the north during the 19th century. Again, you're seeing in blue what I call the unplanned grid, and then a reasserted regular grid that in fact fully resolves all of the problems of development and access in the city of Philadelphia. And I'll show you that in some detail. So when we look at the measurements of the streets, we measured both the east-west and north-south dimensions in the north grid and in the south grid. Sparing you the statistics, the key findings are the following: that the first generation outside of the original grid corrects additional errors, but it introduces distortions. So the correction is that the blocks, again, are 393 feet deep, quite close to Barcelona's block dimension. And in South Philadelphia, even narrower, 328 feet deep. Notice the width remains the same because the Penn grid streets are extended north-south. Distortions is that the grids they're not parallel. So you end up with streets that are askew, which is a common problem in city development. Boston, the streets are all askew. But even around Back Bay, you find streets quickly run askew when they leave the Back Bay. Maybe you'll see that. So my conclusion here is that this was an intermediate stage of street and block development in the city of Philadelphia in the late 18th, early 19th century, before a planned grid was reimposed in the 19th century that would constitute the kind of ultimate resolution of the challenge of developing this urban fabric. Continuing the exploration of maps, this is an 1811 map where I was simply starting to look at how these this grid was surveyed, and you start to see regular streets appearing. It's a complicated picture, and I'm not an urban historian, so I didn't get into this in detail, but there were multiple municipalities, and somehow they were all collaborating on the extension of the survey. It'll take a more detailed historian than me to sort out who that was and what that dialogue was, but I've never been able to find anything about that. Quite interesting. And then an 1824 map that shows a survey extending, and then this map, which is 1835, which is pretty interesting. It's showing a grid that is total across. Essentially, the map maker says the grid is extending as far as you want it to. The urban development is much, much, much smaller. Very much like early maps of Barcelona, where Cerdà had created the ensanche, and then Barcelona grew out within the ensanche. This is what Philadelphia started to do. It started to grow out within a pre-existing grid, much like New York and Barcelona. Some key findings: I said an optimal solution. So there's further error correction here, that the blocks are actually larger than they were in the unplanned version, 422 feet or 534 feet deep. Thank you. So this is, in a sense, an ultimate stage of street and block development in the middle to late 19th century, perfectly balancing, I think, street circulation needs with land development needs and providing a rich range of choices. Let's look a little bit at the grid as a promoter of housing diversity as I conclude. We'll look at South Philadelphia. This is something to pay close attention to. These tertiary streets, notice they're extremely regular. You'll find a square block with two. This is the pattern of Philadelphia. Sometimes they run north-south, sometimes they run east-west. That means you can't travel for long on those streets, but you can travel for a few blocks, and they certainly provide access to the interior of a block. When you look at those block interiors, these are just a few sample blocks we looked at, you start to see there's even a fourth street network that's provided, what we call quaternary alleys. They are less than 1 meter wide. Today, they're mostly all closed, and I think they were originally maybe for coal or for refuse removal. They're mysterious. They take different forms. Sometimes they end at a street. And then you see the row houses, and notice that the row houses are all different sizes, and the parcels are different widths. It's the same in South Philadelphia. I grouped these into parcel families and found that a single block, such as this one, would have 5 different families of parcel depths and dimensions. And as a result, you have different architecture filling that in. And when you look at the parcel areas, you see that you could have housing that went from maybe an area of X to about 2.5X, a very large diversity of housing possible. Again, I contrast this with the almost invariant nature of 19th century Barcelona and New York development, which was a single grid with almost a single pattern of housing, the New York brownstone. They're all 18 to 20 feet wide. They're all the same depth, but in Philadelphia, they're all different, and you have up to five types of housing within a single block. So key findings. Circulation is permitted, but not prioritized. Oh, by the way, mixed uses are found only on the periphery. So you find mixed uses often at the corners and scattered. So mixed uses, which I'm not showing in this, are also featured. They're developed with housing, but they permit through circulation a wide variety of housing types from small to large. And as a result, it generates block subdivision that shapes circulation, but also this incredible diversity. And just a few images of this as we see it in aerial photograph of North Philadelphia. These are what you find on narrow streets, and these are what you find on wider streets. You find 2 versus 3-story houses. These houses are also maybe a foot or 2 wider, intentionally so. It's not an accident. So a few items for discussion might come perhaps later since I know I'm over. Let's think about evolutionary versus rigid grids and the advantages of both. What are the optimum dimensions of a grid for promoting activity on the ground floor and vitality on the ground floor? Is housing an independent or dependent variable? That means, should a housing form shape the dimension of a city fabric, or vice versa? Should the city fabric shape the housing, or are they completely unrelated? Who does this? Is it an architect? Is it a surveyor? Is it the builder? Is it the urban designer? And then thinking about how a grid can remain flexible as density increases. It hasn't happened in Philadelphia. It's still all the original housing. And we can think about the relevance of these essentially 19th century lessons that achieve a lot in terms of urban development for our cities today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, Brent, if you want to. Sure. Yes, Conrad.
Brent, not to create more work for you, but my research shows that coming to frontages, inactive frontages are often the result of a tension between the building typology and the grid. Often when the building is too big for the grid to fit into, right? That's where you get the back streets that just don't fit properly. Are you thinking of perhaps looking at this grid adaptability as it relates to facades? Would that be an interesting follow-up step? Especially thinking about center city. So this is a fairly mid-density row housing type, but as density went up in center city, it started to kind of crush into the grid, creating back streets of blank walls.
So this is obviously, Is this on? This is obviously a 19th century development pattern of comparatively small houses. This is not the large, what Kevin Lynch called the sort of gross grain, the crude grain of urban development today. And when you go to Center City, Philadelphia, it's the only place where there's been substantial 20th century redevelopment within the grid. It's a different story. I don't think there's any systemic lessons to be drawn from it, but developers are all struggling to see how they can fit their development into these grids. But remember that this systemic pattern, which is a block with two through, they're not alleys, they're tertiary streets, right? Housing, these are alleys. The alleys are just 3 feet wide. Today, they're all gated off. The city claims it doesn't own them, but the owners don't own them either. I think it's actually probably like 3 square kilometers of space in the city of Philadelphia that no one knows who owns it. That's a side issue. But this is not found in Center City. So this is not subject to contemporary development pressures for the most part. What is the more irregular grid that I showed you at the beginning. But that would be an interesting further study.
Size and get more from these blocks, or are you just kind of distributed once you've laid out your city?
So I think the resistance of property owners is very long-standing, and I'm just go back to this drawing to show you that I think the reason why these streets began at irregular intervals is if you remember the map, you remember that the city looked like this. It's hard to cut streets through existing built-up areas, right? Because property owners resist. You have to go through eminent domain condemnation in a democracy or in a libertarian society. Very hard to accomplish that. If a block is comparatively low density, and Salt Lake it's fairly low density, it's easier to do so, but you might do so it might be somewhat erratic depending on property boundaries. And you see exactly that happening here, this kind of crazy quilt pattern. It's because developers were subdividing to get access to the interior of the block, right? You want to fully utilize the land. If you think about New York blocks, so much of if you put housing on a New York block, so much of the space is wasted because you have about 50 or 60 feet in the block interior that can't be developed. There's no way in. And so people say, oh, you have beautiful backyards in New York, but it's a waste of space in a city. So you can subdivide blocks that are fairly low density. It's hard to do so in a systemic way if they're already strongly built up, but it can be done. And I'd say Salt Lake would be a good candidate for that if there was enough developer will to do so. Probably in the densest parts of the city, there would be some impetus for that. But the scale of development has also expanded. So sometimes developers will just fill out the whole block, I'm guessing, and they don't need to subdivide.
Somehow you found Philadelphia a better grid than one of Barcelona. Barcelona related. And it seems that like what you are showing is like an extensive development of like one singular block that has 10 like many correctors. Whereas in the Barcelona case, a 3 by 3 block, where like some of I think it's like 116 by 116. That is like what you are showing of the singular housing. But then in the case of Barcelona, like each of these will have like a school. So the 3 by 3 will accommodate the accesses that you are not building. So at the beginning of the presentation, you said that you will argue that this grid was more flexible, but in which ways we're talking about?
So I understand those 3 by 3 blocks in Barcelona, but they're quite rare. They're found at intervals, but they're not a common fabric. So in Barcelona, you find a similar problem. You find a perimeter of housing, and then you find an interior, which you can see easily now in Google Earth, that's developed usually at much lower densities, and sometimes it's the interior of shops. So it's good for the interior of shops, and thank goodness, because it's not good for anything else. or else it would be subdivided into tiny backyards. It would be kind of a wasted space like that of New York. I think the point in urban development is to permit the interior of blocks to be accessed in order for that space to be developed. In the case of Philadelphia, the block subdivision, it permits a lot more housing, and you could probably calculate the percentage of housing that exists in this, let's say in this part of South Philadelphia. It could be approximately half of all housing is facing those interior blocks. When you think about adding 50% to the volume of housing in a city, that would benefit today Barcelona and New York tremendously. But their grids don't permit it without popping up and going to a much higher density model. And that's, I agree that if you did subdivide the Barcelona block in that way, and I recall a couple of those examples, it works really well, but it's not as widespread.
One last question, and we have to move on. So a follow-up about real estate. So subdivided coming from million by another, or the land is parcel up. So like, the land ownership structure being more large chunks of one subdivided, or
So the process of this is really, it's a great mystery to me. It's possible that there was some kind of urban regulation that might even have required these two alleys. But then you also find such variation in it that it appears that maybe it was just a vernacular pattern, that developers identified this as an optimum solution and then they just copied. I think that's also equally as conceivable because this development pattern continued for several decades. And it was really in an era before there were strong housing regulations like New York had, tenement laws and that sort of thing. But these are row houses, they weren't subject to that. So I haven't found those regulations that required it. I think of it more as developers identifying a model that works and then replicating it.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you.